So it's a brave new world. I told Don if a bot comes, kick him out. OK, bonjour et bienvenue à tous. Nous sommes ravis que vous soyez ici avec nous ce soir, en personne ou en ligne. I'm Laurie Schubert, the Executive Director of the Quebec Writers Federation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Writers Out Loud event on navigating the impacts of Bill 96. We're thrilled to have a distinguished and passionate panel of writers with us this evening, including our moderator, Guy Rodgers, to whom I will turn over the mic in just after a couple of formal statements. As we begin, we give thanks and we remember. We give thanks for the land we live on and the waters that surround us. And we remember that Jojage, Montreal, the land upon which QWF has made its home, has been a gathering place for millennia and still remains the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk people and other First Nations. We recognize the stories and ongoing oral practices of the Indigenous peoples of these lands, which inform our work as writers and literary artists. I don't like a handheld mic. We remember that we, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, settlers, immigrants, and people brought here against their will live in this country together. We must never forget our experiences and roles and those of our ancestors in colonization and subsequent injustices, and we must strive to live alongside one another in peace, mutual respect, and as allies to steward the lands and waters that sustain us. We must walk gently and respectfully on these lands and commit to investing QWF resources and efforts towards this goal in friendship, esteem, and in the pursuit of justice and equality. The final statement originates from the QWF policy on safer spaces and events. QWF is proudly dedicated to working toward a safe, respectful, and inclusive environment for everyone. We will not tolerate any behavior that is predatory, harassing, or hateful. No participant at a QWF event should ever be made to feel physically or psychologically unsafe, intimidated, or harassed. So please look out for each other. And if you need support tonight, feel free to talk to me or one of the active listeners. Tonight, it's Riley and John in the back. Thank you both for doing that tonight. You can read the full Safer Spaces policy, which includes the reporting process. Fortunately, we've not yet had to use it in the policies section of our website. And now, as promised, I will introduce our moderator. I would hate to miss an opportunity to praise him. I know most of you probably know well who he is, but he's done so much for the English language, arts, and culture community that I'm going to go ahead and read his bio. A graduate of National Theatre School's playwriting program and longtime arts activist, Guy Rex Rodgers was a co-founder of the Quebec Drama Federation and the Quebec Writers Federation. He was a member of the original board of the Conseil des Arts et des Lettres du Québec and the founding executive director of the English Language Arts Network, known as ELAN. In 2015, he was appointed a companion in l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres du Québec. Since leaving ELAN repeatedly, Guy has written and directed 8 documentary films about Anglos in Quebec in collaboration with MAtv, the National Film Board of Canada, and CBC. He also writes a monthly column about culture, politics, and history for the Montrealer magazine. I will now turn the evening over into Guy's capable hands, and the mic will go on the table for our panelists.
Thank you, Laurie. We give Laurie a little hand here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So welcome tonight. Welcome to the people in the room, and I see folks are still arriving. Welcome to all my theatrical training. No, I have a lapel mic. So, and welcome to the folks who are online. This is a difficult topic. It's certainly a timely topic. What we're not going to do tonight is give you a legal analysis. Our folks here are not lawyers, and we're not going to give you the complete detailed backstory of where Bill 96 comes from and how it was developed. What our panelists are going to talk about is how it's affecting them, their lives, and how it affects writers, artists, parents, students. At the end of the questions, I have a lot of pre-prepared questions. There will be time for you and you folks online to ask questions. We're scheduled to end at 8:30, but they've told me they're prepared to go till pumpkin time, midnight. So we'll go until you run out of questions, all right? Sorry, Laurie. So what I'm going to do is introduce our panelists one at a time, and then I'm going to have them say a few words about how they conceive this discussion and also their relationship to Quebec, just so you get a little bit of a sense of their perspective on these issues. So I'm going to start with Vanessa. So Vanessa Sasson is a professor of religious studies in the liberal arts department of Marianopolis College, where she has been teaching since 1999. She is also a research fellow at the University of the Free State and a research member of UQAM's Center for India and Southeast Asia Studies. Vanessa is the author of The Birth of Moses and the Buddha, a paradigm for the comparative study of religions, published by Sheffield University Press. And her most recent book, published by Equinox 2023, is The Gathering, a story of the first Buddhist women. And I just understood that it's nominated for a QWF prize. Congratulations. So just tell, yeah, go ahead. So tell us a few words about how you see this panel and what you think are the strengths and weaknesses of it, and a little bit about yourself.
Well, this is something that we talked about. Is that all right? It's working. So I'm from Quebec. I've lived here all my life. I'm one of those bizarre anomalies that have actually been able to build an academic life at home. So I've never left home. I mean, I've left home, but I've lived here all my life. So I've been kind of at the front row seat of the story of Quebec all my life. I've been also an outsider of the Quebec narrative in a number of different ways, as someone who grew up with immigrant parents, who grew up Egyptian Jewish, who felt as an outsider just because of that. But I'm also very, very strongly bilingual. I'm married to a French Catholic Quebecois, my husband. It's weird to put him in a category, but it's true. So I feel like I'm deeply connected and tied to Quebec on the English side, on the French side, as an immigrant and as a native. So it's an odd position to be in, but it's one that I'm sure I share with many, many people. One of the things that we talked about when we were setting up this panel was that I found it a little bit difficult that I don't know if I'm fully Anglophone. I don't know what I am, but I'm a mix of 50 things, but I'm more on the Anglophone side. And to have all four of us be Anglophones seemed a little bit off, like it's preaching to the converted or something like that. So I did have that concern, and I would like to have had somebody who could speak from the French side. On the other hand, we're really here to focus on what is the experience of the English artist community, but it is a missing voice, and it was something that I was conscious of. And that if we were going to just identify other missing voices, especially as a teacher at Marianopolis, I'm very conscious of the Indigenous communities and how this law is affecting the Indigenous, and that we don't have their voices here as well. So that was kind of my job here, was to identify for a second that we don't have all the voices. We just have a few voices, and we're going to share what we know and what our experiences are, but there's so many experiences in Quebec. All of you have your own experiences as well, and they're all going to be different. So it'll be great to have a bit of a conversation and to hear what other people's experiences are here. I will say one other thing. It's not really on the menu, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is a panel. We're doing this panel in a moment of really heightened, devastating news cycles. The last week has been really, really difficult for a number of people. Yep, like that, like I have to kiss it. So there's definitely a conversation in my head about exclusion politics right now. And what was an interesting thing that happened was a couple people said, oh, you're going to talk about Bill 96 now, when there's so many bigger conversations to be had. And my thought was, no, I'm doing this now. A, because it was scheduled, but B, because we have to always keep our eye on exclusion politics. And I think that that's something for us to think about. I'm not making an explicit parallel anywhere, but I think we're seeing very exclusive politics on the news right now that have devastating consequences. And so I think it's really important that we keep our eye on the ball and on our own homes to see what's happening in our backyard and make sure we take care of our community. So I actually think this conversation is really important right now, that we keep having this conversation. That's what I would say about that.
Thank you, Vanessa. So next I'm going to introduce Christopher Neal, who's been a freelance correspondent in Latin America and a staff writer at the Montreal Gazette and the Ottawa Citizen. He held communications leadership positions in Canada's Federal Development Aid Agency and at the World Bank. Since returning to Montreal in 2016, Chris has served on the boards of the Quebec Community Groups Network and the Quebec Writers Federation. He is currently Vice President of the McGill Community of Lifelong Learning and President of the Canadian International Council's Montreal chapter. Chris's 2022 book, The Rebel Scribe, Carlton Beals and the Progressive Challenges to U.S. Policy in Latin America, was shortlisted for the QWF Mavis Gallant Award for Nonfiction last year. So thank you, Chris. So say a few words about yourself and your position. Yeah, let's give Chris a
Thanks for that introduction and for the applause. My relationship with French began very young. When I was 5 years old, I grew up in a town called Hawkesbury, Ontario, which is halfway between here and Montreal. I learned later on it was the place where the family of Chénier, you know, the Patriotes, they took refuge in Hawkesbury. It's as close as you can get to Quebec without being into Quebec, but it feels pretty much like Quebec. It's like 90% French speaking. And my parents, my mother was a German immigrant and my father was Canadian from Ottawa. They decided to send me to French school. And this was before there was French immersion. And so I was the only English kid in my class for 4 or 5 years of elementary school. I was also the only non-Catholic. And so I got a lot of Catholic religion at school. And my parents were kind of academically oriented, not very religious at all. And they saw it as the price you pay to learn French. So anyway, I survived. And I came out, I actually moved when we moved. I was 10 years old when we moved to Montreal and we settled in Baie-d'Urfé. And there I went into an English school. It's kind of curious to come here and go to the West Island is quite English. And I went to MacDonald High School, which is in St. Anne de Bellevue, the hometown of François Legault, by the way. He's a little younger than me, so we didn't hang out with the same crowd. I never met him. And MacDonald High School, it's named after the tobacco tycoon, not the prime minister. So it's been able to keep its name. So it's and it's on the campus of John Abbott College. If you've ever been there, it's quite a well-established, over 100 years old and so on. From there, I did a degree at Carleton University in journalism and political science and economics. And I as you heard, became a journalist and then later a communications manager. And I spoke French all the way through my life. You know, it's been a huge asset. It helped me with jobs. And my first job in Montreal was working with Le Messager de Verdun, which was a weekly newspaper. And my job was I would write all the pieces in English. And then once a week, I would translate all the pieces for the Messager de la Salle into English, while the editor of the Messager de la Salle, the Francophone, would translate my stuff from Verdun into French. And then we'd go out and have lunch together. So, you know, I've always had a very friendly, easygoing relationship with French and with Francophones. And I love French. I love the language. I love Quebec. And you know, I'm very happy here. And I was away for many years, 30 years actually, left, you know, in 1984 and came back, as you heard, in 2016. And I felt almost euphoric coming back and it was a dream to come back to Montreal. So I am happy to be back. But having watched the whole nationalist history play out over 40 years or so, I really feel a sense of dismay with what's happened in the last few years, where it's become coercive and nasty and narrow-minded and not expansive and open. I just finished reading a book by Francine Pelletier, Au Québec, c'est comme ça qu'on vit. It's a really interesting analysis of what's happened, and she had done earlier a documentary film along the same lines, La bataille pour l'âme du Québec. And it's a very thoughtful disquisition on why the nationalist movement of Quebec has become what it is, and has become more of an ethnic nationalist movement, when before it was open and progressive and rich and dynamic and attractive, and now it has the feeling of pushing people away. And I certainly feel, as an English-speaking Quebecer who's kind of axiomatically well disposed towards French, I feel pushed away. So if I feel that, I think people that don't have the language skills that I got from my parents' decision early on, they would feel it all the more. So that saddens me, and so I leave it there.
Thank you, Chris. So now I want to introduce our third panelist, who prefers to be known just as Shelley, single name. She's a graduate and a writer and graduate student originally from India. She recently completed her master's thesis investigating the politics of queer representation in post-colonial Indian theater at the Department of English at McGill University. Her book, Sita and Helen, a graphic novel for young adults, was published by Tulika Books earlier this year. In May, Shelley's paper on Rahul Varma's play Counteroffense was published in the International Association of Theatre Critics bilingual journal, Critical Stages, Sang Critique. So Shelley, can you tell us a few words about yourself and your relationship to Quebec? Yeah.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the lovely introduction. So yes, my name is Shelley, and I moved to Quebec and I moved to Canada around 2 years ago. So I'm a fairly new immigrant. I do not know French. I am currently trying to get myself enrolled into one of the government programs once the wait list of 6 months lets me in and start learning French. I came here as a student. I just completed my graduate thesis at McGill University. Yeah, so all this to say that I am fairly new to the country. I'm fairly new to the province. But I must say, in the last 2 years that I've been here, getting out of bed today, getting myself ready for this panel was one of the most difficult things that I had to do. And I do not say this lightly, but given the current atmosphere, the situation of the society that we are living in, given all that is happening in Quebec, in India, and of course the Middle East, it took a lot of work to remind myself, to motivate myself, to keep on speaking about matters which matter to me, which matter to the larger community. So I acknowledge the pain and the suffering in the world today, and I'm going to strive my hardest to make the smallest difference, because I sincerely believe that every small political struggle matters, that even when one person raises their voice against the smallest injustice, they become part of this larger collective struggle to get freedom, equality, to live with dignity, to live as a human. And for that, I must say, I'm really thankful to QWF for organizing this panel, and more than that, for inviting me to speak here, to make my voice heard, because I feel seen in a space where I have increasingly felt unwelcome, where I have felt unwanted, especially in light of the recent announcement of the fee hike at Anglophone universities for non-Quebec students, which made me rethink all my plans of pursuing further education in the city, of exploring the very vibrant theatrical world that I'm a part of. So yes, as far as my role in this panel goes, I'll be speaking about the impact this bill has had on newcomers, on immigrants like me, and of course, how ridiculous I find this entire quarrel, this ancient quarrel between two European languages, and how this is not the burden that we face of fighting in Quebec right now. So yeah, I'll leave it to here.
Sure, thank you, Shane. Before I ask the first question, I just want to offer one thought about Bill 96. A year and a half ago, I released a film called What We Choose to Remember, which was about English-speaking Quebec, English speakers, allophones. And yesterday in St. Agathe was the 35th screening that I've had of the film, so I've been traveling all around Quebec, talking to Anglophones, allophones, francophones from all around the world. And what we currently have is the CALQ government framing the problem in Quebec being the French language is under threat because it is a small island within a big ocean. Now, if you say that to most Francophones, they'll say, yes, we are always a threat, always will be under threat, and we need the government to protect. So by and large, Francophones will support a proposition like Bill 96. People who are not Francophones, not mother tongue Francophones, not mother tongue Francophones raised in Quebec, here it is a threat against other languages, other forms of immigration. That's what the CALQ is set up, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. As I've been talking to people traveling around Quebec, a different kind of scenario has emerged. If we were to ask all of the people in Quebec, do you want to live in a bilingual state? Anglos would say, allophones, most of them went to school in French. They speak 2, 3, 4 languages. Most Francophones, particularly young Francophones, want to be bilingual. So if we were to frame it as, do you want a bilingual state or a unilingually French state, it would be clear what the people want, and then we could work together to build a more prosperous and happy and structured society. That's not where we are, but hopefully sometime in the future, that's where we can be, all right? So Chris, we're gonna start with you. You helped draft the brief on Bill 96 for the Quebec Writers Federation and ELAN. So you've had quite a bit of time to think about how it affects artists, how it affects writers. So could you just share your thoughts on where we are right now?
Yeah. You prepared a brief? Oh. Okay, yeah. Is that good? Okay, we prepared a brief. This was when Bill 96 was still being debated in the National Assembly. And we would have liked to have been invited to testify before the parliamentary committee that studied it, but we were not. And there were not very many English-speaking groups that were invited. In fact, it was fairly short, and the hearings of the committee were not held for a long time, and not very many groups were invited to testify. And many of those who were very supportive, or found that it didn't go far enough, you know. And so it was, but we prepared a brief nonetheless, and it had 5 main points. One is that Bill 96 excludes many Quebecers by its preamble statement saying that the only official and common language of Quebec is French. We felt it overlooked 1 million Quebecers. Second, we questioned the decline of French hypothesis, which is behind this bill, this now law. We didn't feel that the evidence was persuasive that French was in decline. In fact, if you look back, way back in history, 1850s, Quebec, Montreal was majority English. So if you take a longer view, in fact, it's English that's declined, not French. 94% of Quebecers claim to be able to speak French. About 70% of Quebec's English-speaking minority have learned French. This was something that we observed in the brief, and 80% use French at work. So whether they're Francophone or Anglophone, first language, it doesn't really matter. I mean, what language do you speak at work is what matters. And that was the feeling we have. I think that we take issue too, just generally with the idea that mother tongue and language spoken at home is really the measure that matters. It's not the measure that matters. What matters is what is spoken at work. And of course, French in the home has gone down. English in the home has gone down as well, because we're getting a larger and larger immigrant population who speak neither English nor French at home. And that's going up. That's going up. It's not. It's about 12 or 13% now, but it's gone up from about 5 or 6% 10 years ago. So that's where the change is happening. And especially if you look at young Anglophones, they're very bilingual, very French speaking, 85% or something like that. And the third point was we took issue with the notwithstanding clause, which suspends the guarantees of the Charter of Rights. And in fact, the Charter of Rights with this notwithstanding clause that allows provincial governments to opt out of the protections of the Charter is kind of like a huge hole in the Charter of Rights, in my opinion, a hole through which the CALQ has driven a bulldozer on regular occasions now, almost just as a matter of course, whenever it wants. And our other final points were more specifically to the point on, we felt that Law 96 promotes homogeneity over cultural diversity. We feel as writers and in our own community, we see a huge diversity, and we see that as a strength, not something to be minimized or obstructed. And we felt that this Bill 96 has behind it an idea of Quebec society that's ethnocentric, and that it excludes minorities, rejects cultural diversity, and uses legal coercion to rather than incentives to make Quebec more French. And finally, we wonder, is there a threat to funding for arts groups? The way it is now, there are two major funding bodies in Quebec for arts groups. There's the Conseil des arts et des lettres du Québec, which has about $200 million for artists, including writers, and about 9% of their budget is reserved for English-speaking writers. There's another 12% for cultural minorities, and 2%, I forget the exact percentage, but for Indigenous people also. So they're rigorous about applying these percentages, protecting these envelopes. The same, a little less explicitly, applies to the Société pour les entreprises culturelles, SODEC, Société de développement des entreprises culturelles, which finances or provides funding, 200 million again, roughly, for publishing houses and the movie industry, but companies, not individuals. And there they, for example, they fund 20% of their funding for the film industry is for non-Francophone films. And they don't have specific amounts, but they also provide funding. Yeah.
It's a maximum of 20%.
Yeah, okay. And they do provide funding to English language publishers as well, like Véhicule and Linda Leith and so on. But the point is that I checked as part of my preparation for this panel, I checked with both organizations and had a discussion with them about, is this at risk? I mean, and as far as they're concerned, no, this is business as usual. They haven't received any directives to change the rules that they currently apply. But my sense is that, the McGill Concordia bishops didn't think that the out-of-province students' tuition was at risk. Female Muslim school teachers who wear a hijab didn't think that their jobs were at risk. English-speaking Quebecers didn't think that their charter rights protections were at risk. All of these things have gone by the boards, and everything is there for us until it isn't. And so my sense is we need to be vigilant about this.
Thank you, Chris. That's a good answer. Most of us have been here a long time, or all of our lives. So I'd like to hear what Shelley says about what you understood the linguistic situation was in Quebec when you arrived, and how you've responded to it as you've discovered what's actually going on, and how Quebec would like you to learn to speak French in 6 months.
It was in the summer of 2021, right in the middle of the pandemic, that I came to know that I would be moving to Montreal as my admission letter for McGill came in. And being the obsessive person that I am, I threw myself into researching everything that I could about Montreal, the city where I was going to live for the next 2 years of my life, at least the next 2 years of my life. And what I came to know through conversations with people, through what I read on the internet, was that Montreal had a very cosmopolitan culture, in large because of its reputation as an educational hub, as an intellectual hub that attracted professionals and students from across the globe. And in terms of language, it was mainly bilingual, with English and French being the most spoken languages. This news, I kid you not, excited me. I was so excited to live in a city, to be studying at a university where I could experience the best of both Anglophone and Francophone culture. And in my head, this was the closest that I was going to be to living my dream of being a writer in Paris. So I started learning French in India itself. I had the entire summer, so I enrolled myself in the A1 beginners batch of the local chapter of Alliance Française. And I started learning about how the colors were spelled in French, what the days were called, and studying about oh, the directions on the road look like this. And apparently that's the most important thing to know while living in Montreal. My teacher, who I was learning French from, she was an Indian woman of my age who had been learning this language for 8 years. And this was a tad bit shocking for me because why would a 20-something young Indian living in India dedicate so much time and effort to learning a language which was barely spoken in the country? So when I asked her this question, she told me that it was her childhood dream to write a French novel, a crime fiction French novel. Now, to give you some context, she belonged to the city of Pondicherry, a city in southern India that was under French colonial rule for 280 years and which still has a very thriving francophone arts and cultural and the entire milieu. So it suddenly all started making sense to me why she had this childhood dream. And of course, we had these interesting conversations about our favorite pieces of literature, because even I love mysteries. I love detective fiction, crime fiction. And she went ahead and introduced me to this character called Arsène Lupin, the Gentleman Thief, a series of short stories written by the French writer Maurice Leblanc. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And all I could do was compare this character to another Belgian detective character that I had come to know, Hercule Poirot, written by Agatha Christie. And at one point in my head, all I could think was, I'm going to learn French. I'm going to read these original books of Arsène Lupin. And then I'm going to write a paper comparing the character of Arsène Lupin and Hercule Poirot. All this is to say that I'm not against French. I'm not against learning French. And as I already mentioned, I'm trying to get myself enrolled in French learning courses. So then the recent comments being made by the Minister of Education, the language minister of the province about Anglicization, about how immigrants are threatening the integrity of French language in the city, in the province, they do not make sense to me. I find them utterly baseless. Because what needs to be kept in mind that most of us immigrants, at least from South Asia, are coming from regions with way more diversity of language and culture. I'm from India that has no national language. It recognizes 26 official languages. And beyond this official recognition, there are surveys which have been conducted which say that there are at least 780 active dialects and languages being used in India at this moment. So we come from countries where the language of communication changes the moment you cross the border into a new city. So adapting to this diversity is ingrained in us, which is why all my immigrant friends that I know are studying in McGill right now are also enrolled in these French language learning courses. The artistic diasporic communities that I'm a part of, which consist of first, second, and third generation immigrants, are almost all fluent in French. So then who are these people that the government keeps on referring to? Because making these statements about Anglicization, about threat to French language by immigrants, it not only spreads this illogical fear, but it also diminishes the achievements and contributions of those diasporas who have been living in this country and calling it their home for generations now. So when I object to Bill 96, it's not an objection to Francophone culture or French language. I am not trying to push English at the cost of French. No, my objection is to the unjust and unfair marginalization of the discrimination against non-Francophone cultures and languages. My objection is then to the 6-month deadline that immigrants have been given to master this language and speak it fluently. My objection is to this doubling of fee. And I think that is how I summarize my understanding of language and culture in Montreal.
Thank you. I think you accurately reflect how a lot of people who've arrived in the last 10 or 20 years feel. I mean, almost everybody who comes to Quebec knows that it's French speaking, and that's one of the attractions. They want to speak French, they learn French. I mean, Where the data comes from that the CALQ is using is unknown. I mean, the most recent switch in funding policy at the university seems to not be based on data, but being based on losing a by-election in Quebec City. So that's the kind of information they're working from. So that was nice. That was kind of upbeat. But now we have to talk to Vanessa. Now we have to start getting serious about Bill 96. So, Vanessa, you're working in a college. What you had to say was relevant, interesting, in some cases frightening. A month ago, in the last week, it's become even more ominous. So give it to us straight.
I was just in Hawaii and I was giving a series of talks and I was like basically in paradise, and the person who kept interviewing me on stage described me as bleak. And then you just described, and I'm thinking this is turning into like my international persona. I'm like this dark, bleak person that you're going to have to listen to now. I thought I was a happier type person, but maybe not.
Well, in this context,
In
you
this
have a right
context,
to
I'm
be
pretty
bleak.
bleak. I think I was bleak also in Hawaii. All right, so I'm going to try to explain what we've been going through. We came out of COVID and walked right into Bill 96. So we've had a really rough couple of years. What just came out with the law of the tuition, I don't even know if it's a law. I don't know how they're passing this and under what auspices they're doing this. But this business of changing the tuition for the English universities that just came out seems to have blindsided everyone except us. And so those of us in the CEGEP system are really, really frustrated because we feel like the canary in the coal mine. Like we feel like we have been yelling about this for 3 years. And the only thing that got any attention was when things went too far with like the court system. So like Bill 96 is a huge law. If you look at it, I read it. It's 200 articles. It's 100 pages long. It's a monster. They did not write it out of nowhere. They wrote this a long time ago. They were careful about it. They closed every loophole. They knew what they were doing. They were just waiting for their moment to release it. They have a whole bunch of things that they cover in there. Included in there is what they're doing to the CEGEP education system. Nobody cares about that. So what everybody was worried about was, you know, health and social services and what happens in the court system and what happens in the businesses. Those are where everybody's putting the red flags, and that's what's going to go to court, and that's what everybody's going to try to fight. What nobody is trying to fight is what has been happening to us, and that has been very, very isolating. So we're going to talk about how we feel. I've been really upset for a while. Most of us in the English CEGEP system have been feeling very, very isolated. We have also been feeling very betrayed, and I can explain that. But the risk is that I could tell you technicalities for like an hour. So I'm going to try to just choose a couple of things that will speak to you. But basically, our programs, our academic programs have been ravaged by this law. What has made it to the headlines is the liberal, whatever her name was, I forget her name now. I probably blocked it out, but the liberal MNA, what was her name that did this? Oh, 2 years ago. Anyway, she was the one that threw in, let them just take 3 extra classes in French and we'll call it a day. She just threw that out. There was no consultation. No, what was her? Was it her? I blocked it out. It's like gone from my brain. I feel like it was somebody else. Yeah. Anglos. That's who it was. Yeah. She was in my writing. I didn't vote. It was really bad. So she just threw it out there to support the CALQ and to look like a happy liberal. Let them just have 3 extra classes without consulting with how programs work, how complicated they are to construct. That if we put in 3 extra classes in every program, we have to eliminate 3 extra classes because our students cannot do more. I teach at Marianopolis. Our students are up to here with their workload. They work extremely hard. We have a fantastic college. I know this is not true for every college, but I will say that Marianopolis is a really special place, and I have been there for 20 odd something years. I've had the opportunity, I could have moved on to go to university. I've been happy as a scholar, as a writer, as someone with an international career, right here in my little nook of my small little CEGEP, because it's a wonderful college with great students and great faculty, and we are dedicated to excellence. And what we have felt for the last 3 years is that the government was coming to axe us. And what we were told very clearly by the French CEGEPs was, you're taking all the best students, we want them back. So instead of upping your game, we're going to take a hatchet to you. So how can we take a hatchet to you? Well, we're not going to put Bill 101 on you because that's going to be too much of a mess. PQ is what wants that. The CALQ wants to look more reasonable, so we're not throwing Bill 101 at you. So we'll just cut by 1,000, we're going to kill you with 1,000 cuts. That's the kind of thing that we've been dealing with. For the past 3 years, it's been cut after cut after cut after cut. So one of them was this bizarre thing that everybody saw in the news. Everybody just take 3 extra French classes. And then in the French media, oh, the English don't want to take French classes. What's their problem? No one ever consulted with us. Not one academic, not one person in the education ministry talked to us. We got this from the Ministry of Justice. When does the Ministry of Justice determine how academic programs are organized? I've never seen this before. And that then our programs get put into law. Also, have never seen anything like this. So the whole thing is traumatic in terms of process. Every time we try to go see the ministry, we had people on committees. We have done at Marianopolis had more representation on more committees than you can possibly imagine. They were left at the door. They were not given their documents. They were given 30 seconds. They were not given advance warning. They were treated terribly at every step of the turn. So this feeling that you were talking about, a feeling like excluded and not wanted, they had very clearly as they tried to talk to the Ministry of Education and the government, what are you doing? You cannot rewrite entire educational programs like this. You cannot just throw something and say, go figure it out. But that's what they did. So we were left with no choice. We're all trying to figure it out with virtually no time to figure out who we dump. And so this year is our process of dumping faculty and dumping courses that are there to serve our students so that we can add French classes. But here's where you see where things really don't work. We have 4 semesters in CEGEP if you do it in time. Our students already take 2 French classes in English CEGEP. So how are we going to put 3 mise à niveau class? Like if you're learning, like if you're not a Francophone, how do you have 5 in 4 semesters? Because you can't do 2 mise à niveau in the same semester because they're supposed to be each semester you do a different level, right? You're growing. But now we have 5 in 4 semesters. So we're all walking around going, how does this work? What? I don't understand. You're going to do level 1 and level 2 at the same time, but you haven't finished level 1 yet. Like it doesn't make any sense. So we're scratching our heads with that one. That alone makes, that's your evidence that no one consulted and no one cares. And this isn't about making French better. This is about just throwing something to win so you can go tell your constituents, we're making French stronger in Quebec, but leaving us in a tailspin. Then we have to figure out, okay, we're going to do the mise à niveau. We're going to put these 3 extra classes. It makes no sense, but we'll figure out something. We're going to have to fire a bunch of faculty so that we can add more faculty so that we can put more French classes. So let's get rid of a couple extra history classes that maybe the science students were taking to broaden their horizons. They don't need the history class. Let's just give them more French class. That's also what's happening. So if you do a program in English at Marianopolis, you will have less material that you will learn outside of your program because we had to dump stuff to be replaced with French classes. But if you did the same program in a French CEGEP, oh, you get to do an extra history class or a philosophy class or religious studies class or whatever. You can broaden your horizons and learn stuff which you cannot do in the English sector. So we're creating a 2-tiered education program where the kids who are going to come to us in the English sector will learn less. That makes no sense at all. Then we have the Indigenous students. They don't learn French until grade 10 because they have an agreement with the government, right? Because they're supposed to be learning Mohawk. So the kids that we get from Ganawake, they don't speak French at all. They learn it in grade 10 for the first time. They're supposed to be learning English and Mohawk. That's an old story. It's not mine. But those are the languages they learn. So how are we going to create mise à niveau classes for them when they're at like starting point? And then we have to have the other ones for the Anglophones. And then we have to have other ones for the Francophone kids. But we don't have that many classes that we can offer, that many faculty in that many classrooms. So how are we pulling this off? Absolutely no sense. That's one thing. Let me give you another one. See, I could do this for a while. All right. Another thing that they did, they gave us quotas. Now, for those of you who know anything about history, that word should scare the shit out of you. Sorry, I shouldn't swear. But it's not a good word. And it's certainly not a word that you want to be applying to your own community. And yet that's what we're doing in Quebec. It is a very strange situation. We at Marianopolis and many of the English CEGEPs have the same situation, that we are looking at about 50% of our students come from the French network. The kids are not in this fight. This is a fight of the older generation. My students don't have this fight. They're all bilingual. They don't care. They don't want to know. They know they have to speak English and they know they have to speak French. And if something is going to go, it's going to be French because they're all using Discord to talk to everybody in China and Saudi Arabia and whatever else. Nobody's speaking French on Discord and the international community is not using it, right? So they know if there's a language they have to master by the time they get to university, it's English. So they come to us the second they have a chance. And they could leave the French high schools because they want to learn English. I've had full-on French students who have a hard time pulling a sentence out in English. And I'll tell them, dis-le-moi en anglais, c'est pas grave, en français, c'est pas grave. Say, exprime-toi, like whatever, say what you need to say, and I'll answer you in French, and we'll figure it out, and you'll work out. Non, non, je suis venue ici pour apprendre en anglais. Sorry, I came here to learn. That's what they come to say. They sit there in my office struggling because they want to learn English. Those are the kids I get, not the kids who are in a political fight. They just want to learn. The Quebec government has made it that across the sector, we're only allowed to have 17.5% of the French sector. So what are we supposed to do with that? That drops us down over 30% of our student body. They put a quota on their own students. So now we're like, well, how are we supposed to accept student? Like, how does it? Okay, so you apply, but depending on your language, you get in or you don't get in. Wait a minute, I've seen this in history. It never went well. If you know your history, you know it's not a good idea to be accepting students on anything other than a meritocracy. Because as soon as you start accepting them based on an ethnic background, the color of your skin, or the language that you speak, we get ourselves into trouble. That's the road that we're on. And I don't think that's a smart road to take. So we have to have eligibility certificate. If you have your eligibility, which means your historic Anglo, which is now a new term that we've decided we're all going to use, which is another problem. If I'm speaking too fast and you want to ask me a question, but I can do this for hours. I've been in this for a long time and I'm really mad. So feel free to just tell me to stop. But we have to now take the certificate of eligibility. If you are eligible to learn in English, you get in first. Then we can take in the French. But then do we have to take in all the English? So then we'll take the ones who have 90s and all the way down to the 60s. And then when we're finished with all the English, then we take the super smart French kids. So then we're going to have really terrible English kids and really smart. What? How am I going to teach a class like that? And they're not going to pass in our school. So the kids who come in with the 60s, they're not going to do well when they come to our science programs. That's making a mess of a great school. They shouldn't have their hands in our business like that. But wait, we're not done. Because then not only do we have that, but then we also have another cap that they've decided to do, is that every English college is capped on the total number of students they accept. So Marianopolis, because those are the numbers I know, Marianopolis has been told, since we're around 2,000 students, our number, according to the Ministry of Education, which the Ministry of Education now feels is their job to do, it wasn't getting involved in our academic programs, but what they're doing is telling us how many students we're allowed to have on campus. French colleges can grow as much as they want. They want to have 50 million students, they can have them. Marianopolis is not allowed to have more than 2,003 students. Now, if you know anything about the education programs, what you would very quickly discover is you cannot control that number. Because we accept a bunch of students, some say yes, some say no. And so we're always like moving around in our numbers, right? And so we make a guess, this many will say yes, and then, oh, surprise, too many came. Okay, we'll have to go hire an extra teacher, or whoops, there goes somebody else's job, right? And we're like navigating this situation all the time, but we get it more or less. And then you get a whole bunch that fail, or a whole bunch you thought were gonna fail, they didn't fail. So we're never totally sure what our number is gonna be. We get roundabouts. It's normal for every school on earth. But we are not allowed to go past 2003. What happens if we go to 2004? Do you know? It's like I'm testing you. It's like I'm back in class. Yeah, $15,000 per student. Paid to the government. So we go over by 10 students and we owe them $150,000. So then we say, okay, we're going to go under. So we're going to go to 1950. We're going to aim for 1950 and hope that works out. Great. But then the Ministry of Education reserves the right to lower our number the next year, which means they have set us up in a system that we are a Titanic, and in 5 years we're out. We are the canary in the coal mine. We have been yelling about this for years. We have gone to our unions. We have gone to every committee. We have done everything we can to say, guys, this is a crazy reality that we are in. This makes no sense. They're creating separate education portfolios for students based on language. That alone, if you're historically conscious, you should be worried about. But the rest of it is so undemocratic and extraordinary and penalizing and absurd. And there's nothing we can do, and nobody cares, because you have to understand the technicalities of an education system to be interested in what I'm saying. Right? It's very, I try at one point, I wrote a couple of op-eds last year, but at one point somebody said, write an op-ed where you break it down for us. So I started and I was like, I can't do it. I was like, there's too many pieces of information I have to explain that it's just the devil's in the details. And let me tell you, he's in there. So this is where we're at. And now all of a sudden, McGill and Concordia are like, what? You didn't consult with us and you're going to double our tuition? Yeah, they didn't consult with anybody. They're not pulling their punches and they're not kidding about what they're doing. And they're going to keep going until they're out of office, which may be a long time from now. These restrictions are serious. I'll stop there, but I could say so much more.
Well, the most frightening part is if we get rid of the CALQ, we're most likely to get the Parti Québécois. That's not going to be any better. So you've raised the question of historic Anglo, which affects the education sector. It affects the health sector and everywhere else. I mean, I have all kinds of people asking me, like, what are my rights? Technically, if you did elementary school somewhere in Canada, you are a historic Anglo. You could have been a Francophone who did your school in English, and you're still a historic Anglo. How do you prove it? Will bureaucrats respect it? Because there's this conflict between your right to have a service in English, their right to work in French. It depends on how different institutions are administered. It depends on individual people. It depends on a multitude of things. And, you know, the CALQ Roberts have wanted to implement it with a campaign of sort of benign vagueness. Well, we're not going to ask for any proof. We're just going to trust you. But the feeling is that one day somebody, and I'm going to come to Shelley next, somebody who isn't a historic Anglophone is going to ask for service in English, and then they're going to crack down on us. So, Shelley, I'm sure you've been talking to a lot of people and thinking about it yourself. Like, how do you feel about your role as an Anglophone? And at this point, somebody whose primary language is English and not French, in a place where you have to be an historic Anglophone after you've been here 6 months to have rights to services and maybe receive them. So what are your thoughts about that?
Rights. As a South Asian immigrant, I'm always aware of, I'm always constantly navigating the complexities of my legal status, of what rights I have. I'm always trying to adapt to a new system, a new culture, a new lifestyle. At the same time, I'm always constantly aware of the complicated dynamics of using English, my colonizer's language, as my primary mode of communication, academically, professionally, and creatively. The mainstream usage of India, it concretized during more than 2 centuries worth of colonial rule. But today, using the colonizer's language, that is English, to talk back to Eurocentric narratives, which have a tendency to ignore or marginalize immigrant voices, South Asian voices, is a very commonly accepted phenomena within academic discourses. And this is actually something I have written about in my graduate thesis as well. I talk about the political and linguistic struggles of the people of Tamil Nadu, a state in southern India. Now, I'll give you some context. Currently, India is being governed by a right-wing conservative political party that is pushing forward a very homogenizing nationalist Hindutva narrative, which is based upon the centralization of Hindi, the language of the majority upper caste Hindus in the nation. Now, this linguistic dominance of Hindi threatens to erase the local specificities of the people of Tamil Nadu, their culture, their language, their self-identity. So what have the people of Tamil Nadu done? They have used English, they have appropriated English and called for its political legitimization as a national language to push back against this linguistic dominance of Hindi that threatens their culture. Now, I constantly keep on drawing parallels between the situation in India and the situation in Quebec. So when I object to Bill 96, I am, of course, not saying let's have English and forget about French. Let's curtail Francophone culture. No, that's not the goal here. The goal instead is to call for equitable consideration and access to economic, political, legal resources for non-French speaking communities, for immigrant communities, for racialized communities, for First Nations communities. It is to initiate this conversation about a more diverse, about a more complex view of Quebecois culture, which takes into equal account what has been clumped together in this label of third world. Because I am one of the many who is constantly experiencing the consequences of Bill 96 in her daily life. I am one of the many who could not book an appointment at a clinic in Montreal when I needed urgent access to healthcare because I could not speak French. Now, somebody can argue that technically Bill 96 does not restrict healthcare services in English. To which I would say, but Bill 96 does make sure that the province is under no obligation to provide healthcare services in English. And by giving such great discretionary powers to language officers, they're also making sure that healthcare workers constantly live under the fear of being reported if they provide information to their patients in English. And as Vanessa said, there's so much confusion. And in this confusion, in this vagueness, is that power that people constantly live in fear of using any other language but French. I'm one of the many who cannot afford to continue pursuing higher education at McGill because of the fee hike. So, sorry? Yes, non-research graduate students, but if I decide to go for a non-research master's program again, then yes, I will be affected. So it's only applicable for thesis students. So I think that is all that I have to say about how the rights of people like me are getting affected by Bill 96 on a daily basis.
Good, thank you. So Chris, you've talked about your concern about Bill 96 affecting or diminishing cultural diversity. That will affect a lot of writers and artists. So do you wanted to share your thoughts about how that might impact us?
Yeah, it's pretty depressing to hear these testimonies. I have to say it, and it's hard to be to feel optimistic about it with this because, as you said, I mean, the CALQ could be around for quite a long time. They're very popular, and the alternatives aren't much better. One thing that struck me about the cultural diversity and French and English, or French in any other language, French is the world's 5th most widely spoken language. Right? I see Julie Barlow is in the audience, has written a book, The Story of French, so I hope I'm correct. But I looked it up on the website of the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. There are 321 million people in the world who speak French. And of those, 144 million, 45%, speak it as a second language. And we Anglophones who are bilingual, or Anglophones who've learned French, we're Francophones. If you've learned French, you're Francophone. So a lot of Anglophones are in fact Francophones in Quebec, and this is an example of this is not the issue whether you're what your original language is. If you want Quebec to be French, encourage those who don't speak French to learn French. they want to learn French. We just heard it from Shaylee, and you just described all your students. They all speak French. There, I mean, you'd have to almost not have a pulse to live in Quebec as a young person and not learn French. It just it boggles my mind. When I think about how do we, Guy and I were both on the board of the Quebec Community Groups Network for a few years, and we kind of thought, how do we deal with this? What's the strategy? But we don't seem to make a dent or penetrate the Francophone majority with our concerns about this. They're not interested. They're not even listening. It's just seen as marginal and on the side, and kind of a blissful lack of awareness about it, or and not understanding either the depth of frustration and fury and unhappiness that there is in our community about it. And I think we need to come up with a way of reframing it. And maybe a way is to say, look, we are Francophones. Leave us alone. We already speak French. We've made an effort to learn French. I mean, what more can we do? We can't change the fact that our mother tongue is not French. And this is, I'm at a loss. I don't know where we can go from here. I mean, this is something maybe I'd be interested in the Q&A period. Perhaps we can get some ideas from the audience. But a final point before my profession was as a communicator, communications manager. I think about how do you explain, promote, and defend the agenda and the interests of one or another organization. So, and I know a measure of success in a communications campaign is when you get other people to carry your message. People who are not of your group that are, they're repeating the things that you want them to repeat, that you've been telling them. And my sense is that this is what's happened already with Quebec. You've won, you've already won. I mean, why are you picking on us? It's very irritating when you've made the effort and then you still, it's not enough. We want to go and hit you some more. And my only explanation for it is that it's a populist. This is a populist government, a populist political party. It's part of the movement that you were describing in India with Modi and Erdogan and Turkey and Trump in the United States. I mean, this is the Quebec version of it. And the way that you succeed politically is by dividing your audience and finding an internal enemy that everyone can say, sort of get, the George Orwell, the 5 minutes hate, or I maybe I'm exaggerating, but it kind of feels like that sometimes. But it's very difficult to deal with that kind of situation. At the same time, I think there's been a decline in the level of civics and civic education and the quality of debate, where things are reduced to a tweet or to a catchy, gimmicky slogan, and there isn't really much exchange and sharing to come to a shared truth or build a consensus, and that's what we really need. You were saying, Guy, and pulling it together. How do we should discuss these things to decide what kind of society we want, and then work together to achieve that. But that's not the way our government, or that's not the way our province is being governed. And they're not interested in that kind of in that kind of approach. And I think as anyone who's a Democrat has to believe that it's fundamental. And if you don't have that kind of approach where everyone has a voice and where you come to consensus together, then you don't really have an authentic democratic society.
Well, I thanks for that, Chris. I think it's important to remember that the government has really taken this. We could go back on the history of where the CALQ came from and how they saw an opportunity to annihilate the Liberals and annihilate the Parti Québécois and gain a strong majority, which they did. I mean, we can understand how that happened. But the way they framed this is so devious, because Francophones here, they're protecting our language. That's all they hear. I mean, all of the Francophones I know are oblivious to what's actually happening to Anglos. They're not aware of what's happening. They don't dislike us. They wouldn't like this to happen. And as these stories come out, I think the general feeling will change. And we see a lot of backlash against the CALQ. They lost the by-election. They're facing a massive public service strike in a couple of weeks. I mean, the CACers, the magic is starting to rub off. So when the rest of Quebec realizes the sort of things that Vanessa was talking about, I don't think they'll be supporting it. I think that it will turn around. And so I want to come back to Vanessa, because you talked about the impact on the institutions. I'd like to hear a little bit about the impact on kids, but you have something else you want to say
Yeah, no,
first.
I do. I mean, I'm listening to what you guys are saying, and it's very hopeful. But this is a politics of us and them. And so, and it's it's ethno-nationalism. This is the right kind of Québécois, and that's not the right kind of Québécois. That's a really dangerous way to identify your citizens. So I don't know that I don't know that I can agree with what both of you guys are saying, because as soon as you start saying this is who Québécois are, you've got a politics of exclusion. And then it's going to be, oh, you're a French Canadian, but you're not quite the right kind. I mean, I've been told I'm Québécois, but not really, because I don't have the accent just right. Right? So I don't know, I had a whole bunch of things that I was thinking about when you were talking, but I do think that there's something really dangerous in this precedent, and I think we have to take it seriously. And even if I think it's true that many people in the région just want their kids to be bilingual because their kids are talking English on Discord too, and they want their kids to be able to work everywhere, and everybody would like their kids to know many things, I think it's really easy to push a narrative into a really destructive conversation. And I think that's where we're headed. I don't think it's healthy, and I think we have to take it really seriously. So I'm not doing this. I don't want to create an us and them that now the French are bad. That's not my purpose here. I think this political discourse is really dangerous, and I think we have to take it seriously. There was something else that you were saying that made me jump, and then I was trying to, and I lost it because I got stuck on that.
Well,
I can't remember what it was.
Maybe it will pop back into your mind.
Darn it. I had a really important, it's gone. I can't remember. What was your question?
You talked about the impact on the institutions, and you referred a little bit to the impact on the kids and their parents. So can you just give us a couple of examples of really how it's going to impact the students?
Well, the students are being pushed into streams that are separating them by language. It's complicated to explain how this is going to play out in their day-to-day lives, but they are being separated by their language, and they're going to be in separate classes based on their language. So there are certain courses that they now will have to take, like they'll have to take some history courses in French if they're from a French school, and they'll have to take their history courses. This is a nightmare for us in terms of organization, but that's our problem. For them, it means the French kids study together and the English kids study together and the Indigenous kids study together. That's not a healthy situation. We're also losing all of our international students through this, right? We have 14% of our students are coming internationally, most of them from China and Korea and Japan. We're going to lose them all, right? Because they're all going to have to pass an exam in French at the end of their 2 years. That's insane. So the government has put all kinds of little details like that to shut us down and shut us down and shut us down. So we're applying to become a bilingual college. That's the only way we're going to survive this, which is something that we can do, but that other CEGEPs, because we're private, because we're small, because we can organize ourselves, we might have a way of surviving this. Other institutions might not. Now you have McGill and Concordia that are going to be struggling. One of the things that I did want to tell you that happened that kind of goes in line with maybe not the optimistic tone that you, one of the things that devastated us was we're part of a union that goes with all the CEGEPs. And so we thought the union's job was to protect jobs and protect their faculty. We were relieved of that impression. We've been paying union dues, we're still paying union dues, but the union is supposed to be there for labor. We're labor, that's the whole thing. So our administration said, work with the unions. Maybe like we're all like trying to figure out how do we survive this situation, because if they apply this, we lose jobs. So we went to the union. The union admin were worried about labor because they're real enthusiasts and feel very strongly about their commitment as union leaders. But the union members, there are 47 or 48 CEGEPs in Quebec. I think 7 of them are English. The rest are French. They decided they wanted to take a vote to see, it actually includes, the union includes also universities and high schools. And they asked to have a vote across the board to apply Bill 101 to CEGEPs, which would completely decimate us. We said this is not the mandate of a union. There's no reason to be doing this. And they said, we want it. We've asked for it. It's on the docket. It has to happen. The universities did not come because it doesn't matter. It's a CJEPS or fight. We don't need to pay attention. The admin didn't help the admins. The university admins did not coordinate with our admins. Like, we were completely left. But we thought, who's going to vote for this? You're going to vote to destroy us? Like, this is not what unions do. They voted to destroy us. Our colleagues, we're partnered with Brébeuf. We do programs where our students can do a semester at Marianopolis if they go to Brébeuf. I mean, this is the problem. Isn't this the ideal? And our students, Marianopolis can go to Brébeuf for a semester, and the Brébeuf kids can come to us for a semester. They're our sister school. We work with them. They're our friends. They voted for this. So I'm a little less enthused about.
And clearly we can see why. Yeah.
I'm just like, wow, you guys are our brothers and sisters, but then as soon as they get it, and it's not, their backs aren't up against the wall. So it's not like your back is against the wall, so then you defend yourself. Their backs aren't up against the wall at all. They're just like, oh, we have an opportunity to smash you. Let's do it. So that was a really devastating moment in our college. The depression levels were really, we got hit hard with that. We didn't expect that. And so now there's the discussion. Do we have to form a new union? Do we leave this union? Like, there's only so many fights we can do at the same time. So I think we need to take this really seriously. I think if you push any population to start identifying who's in and who's out, they'll do it. Every population does this. This is not exclusive to Quebec. We're seeing it everywhere in the world. You give a group an opportunity to get the upper hand, they'll take it. We as human beings need to be civilized. We need to have law, and we need to have culture, and we need to have morals, and we need to push on those morals and make sure we hold to them. Because if you let go, every population under the sun is prone to becoming really bad. That's what our news cycle is all about. So I think we have to catch this. And we can't, oh, this is what I wanted to say. No one else I know anywhere in the world talks about francophones and anglophones and allophones.
Yeah.
No.
This is weird.
Mhm.
So we're drinking the Kool-Aid. Can I just say, this is nuts. Wait, like, and that we keep defending ourselves. I speak French. I believe in French. I will write in French. I will do. Enough already. We don't need to defend this. We're human beings and we're citizens of Quebec. Ça suffit. Like, it's just, I don't need to prove that I speak French to be treated as an equal human. I speak 7 languages, for Christ's sake. Like, this is, I mean, not all well, really not well. Let's call it what it is, right? But I've studied and been trained in 7 languages. I speak a couple well, but that's it. But honestly, I don't go around the world going, I'm a Nepalite or I'm a, like, what is this? We don't do, this is not how you define a citizen. These are not, we're not supposed to drink the Kool-Aid. We shouldn't have to be saying, I'm a good French Canadian. I belong to Quebec. I was born in Quebec. I have Quebec citizen, says your fee. I'm part of Quebec. Treat me properly. I'm mad.
Thank you. So we're at that stage of the evening where the clock is ticking and it's time for you to have your chance. So Riley's going to grab this mic here. You folks online, John will take your questions. We will answer your questions. So you've heard a lot about what they're thinking. You're all here because you've been thinking about this. Maybe you have a question, maybe you have some information you want to share with us. But the floor is now open to the audience in the room and online. Yes, get the microphone, please, so that they can hear you at home.
This has nothing about. I'm just wondering, how did you manage to go to a Catholic school, a French Catholic school? Because my mother wanted to send me to French school. She was French speaking when we came to Canada, but she couldn't because we were not Catholic. She tried. And so I landed up on the English side. But how is it that you were able to get into a French school?
I was pretty young at the time, so I don't really
You
know.
don't really know.
What does it mean? But it was in Ontario.
Oh, it
And
was in Ontario.
Yeah, and I think
Would not happen here.
and I
no.
think my parents had to pay. They had to pay extra, because it was a separate school board that they had.
Okay, it was in
In
Ontario.
Ontario at
All
the
right.
time.
Okay, that's different.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's different. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah,
at the
then
time,
and then the difference between Catholic and Protestant was really important.
Yes,
I-
that's
I'm-
what yes, I
It was a
know.
big deal.
Yeah.
then, you know, like, so.
Yeah.
Well, you raise a good point. I mean, that's a very important piece of Quebec history between the Second World War and Bill 101.
Yeah.
An extraordinary number of people who were not Catholic were rejected from the Catholic school system, went into the Anglo school system, and then that led up to all of the animosity that led to Bill 22, 63, 101, and
And in
96.
fact, a friend of mine, Joe Rabinovich, who he was Director General of the Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal for a time. And I said, Joe, this is crazy. You're a Jew. He says, I know. I go to education conferences and, the people, they think it's kind of odd. But that's the oddness of Quebec, I guess, in a way. But yeah, minorities studied in English because they weren't accepted in the Catholic School Board, which was the French school board then, and they de facto became Anglophones. But they weren't Anglophones; they were from Hungary and Russia and Europe, Italians. So
There's a large number who came here French speaking from Morocco or even from France.
yeah. But let me take
Yeah.
advantage of your question, though. One of the points that Francine Pelletier made in her book, which is really interesting, is that when they brought in Bill 101, so that all immigrant children would go to French schools, they didn't really think through the idea that there's going to be a métissage of what is a Québécois. And you will have people speaking French avec un accent québécois from all over the place. They'll look like every color of the rainbow and every religion, and they won't be Christian. It won't be white. It won't be what you're used to seeing. And I don't think that was fully understood, and I'm not sure that the sort of francophone de souche have really taken it on board, because there's a certain hidebound quality to when you say francophone de souche. Even saying that, like in a lot of societies, that would be considered politically incorrect to make comments like that, and I think it should be politically incorrect. That's a positive thing, like you shouldn't be saying, oh well, he's of this color and he's of this and he's of that religion and the other. No, that's exactly as you were saying. And this is kind of weird. And now we've gone the other side, where before you were excluded if you were from some other background. You couldn't go to the schools. Now you must go to the schools.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
One of the things that's arisen with the tuition debate, but it also arose with Bill 96 and particularly 2021, is the notion that it is okay in this place to discriminate. It is okay to do things deliberately, blatantly, to an identifiable group, which is the Anglophone community, that you wouldn't dare do to any other identifiable group. And that extends to a really hateful column that I read today in Devoir by Jean-François Lisée. Oh, he got into all kinds of history about McGill and how it used to discriminate against Jews and so on and so on and so on. And it was a screed. And a former colleague of mine, who I sort of work with a little bit these days, said, why does this society tolerate stuff like that? Why is it okay to say these things? Why is it okay to discriminate and say hateful things about Anglos, but nobody else? And I'm eager to hear the answer.
Anybody want to propose an answer? I thought it was a rhetorical question.
Well, I think
Microphone, yeah.
something that I've been thinking about that I find very odd also, not just this francophone, anglophone, allophone that we're all trying to defend ourselves were enough, which often oppressed societies do. They try to prove that they're good enough, right? So it's the same thing. But the Quebec French-Canadian current narrative seems to be positioning itself as though they're the indigenous culture of Quebec. And therefore, they're the oppressed, colonized culture, but they're not. This is, right, this is the part that like, I keep thinking, I think of my Indigenous students and I think they must feel crazy half the time. Like, this doesn't make any sense. This is, and Shelley said this before, this is an argument between two European cultures that colonized an Indigenous land. That's what this is. But we're erasing that history and we're deciding that the French are the Indigenous because they came first. The English are the bad guys, but the English colonized the French, colonized the Indigenous. Like, we're living in crazy lands. Yeah. And we have to identify that. And we have to rectify this historical narrative. We have to bring the Indigenous back into the conversation because this history is long. You cannot say, I'm going to start the history in the 1600s with Marguerite Bourgeois or Champlain or whoever you want, right? You can't start it arbitrarily there, but that's what we're doing. And then you are the victimized, oppressed. Now, doesn't mean that the French community wasn't oppressed by the English. They were. And there are reasons for this history, and we need to know that history, but doesn't mean we have to pursue it and continue it or say, now I'm going to do it to you, right? But I do think our historical narratives are wrong, and I think it's important that we rectify it, and we have to bring the Indigenous back into the conversation.
So Chris or Shelley, any additional thoughts?
Can I just add on to that?
Sure.
And even beyond changing the ideological discussion about the historical narrative, as Christopher mentioned earlier, the usage of the notwithstanding clause and how in like using it over here can lead to very harmful precedents for the future. I'd also like to point out logically this principle of asymmetry that this entire bill, this entire charter is based upon. That is also providing a very harmful precedent for the future, because if today we as a society think that it's okay to limit the rights of English-speaking Quebecers, then at some point in the future, there just might be some government which might say that, listen, we can go ahead and limit the rights of French-speaking Canadians elsewhere. And there will be precedent that they can look back to and refer. So even logically, as a democracy, is this the best step in having this ingrained in the Canadian Constitution, in the Canadian Charter?
Chris, anyone, you want to add anything there? You don't have to, it's fine. So just, we have a question from somebody online. I just want to go. Okay, we have one here and then one here, then we'll go online. How about that?
I just want to start off by saying thank you to all three of you for sharing your perspective on this and teaching me so much tonight. My question was more specifically targeted to Ms. Sasson on the Bill 101 and how it would apply to CEGEPs. I would just like to know more about that. Thank you.
If Bill 101 were applied? Well, if it were applied, then it would mean that only Anglophone students could go to English CEGEPs and Francophone students would have to go to French CEGEPs. So given that we're right now at 50-50, that would decimate us as an institution. It would also take away what is basically adults, because most of our students are 17 when they arrive and they're 18 5 minutes later. So they're adults who are being told they're still not allowed to study in English or in French, right? So this is taking away like, I understand it's really important that that a culture has a say in the education they give to their minors, and that we impose that education, that we create this is the oldest story in the book, right? Is that a government and the governing bodies, and usually the church, gets involved in creating a curriculum that determines what they want their young citizens to learn so that they become helpful citizens in the future and in the languages that you wanted to learn. So the Bill 101, I actually think worked out quite well in terms of ensuring that everybody in Quebec does speak French in a way that wasn't true when I was a kid, right? I went to French high school as a fluke, but if I didn't, I wouldn't be as bilingual as I am now. So I do think, and this is probably a controversial thing to say, that streamlining young people to have an education in French makes a lot of sense in a French province, but there's a point at which that has to stop. And if both colleges and universities belong to the Ministry of Higher Education, which is separate from the Ministry of Education, which is high schools and primary schools. When you get to higher education, this is where you're starting to treat people like adults. You're not required to do higher education. You are required to go to school until you're 16, ideally finish high school. So that's where the government gets to say. But if the government now continues to say, the overreach is quite extraordinary.
You know, I'm old enough to have been, I covered Camille Laurent when I remember they had a special ceremony when he announced that the government of Quebec would give money to Dawson College to buy the Notre Dame congregation, the place where Dawson College is now. And at that time, Camille Laurent was saying, you know, exactly what you're saying. These are adults. Bill 101 won't apply to cegeps. They're grown-ups, they get to decide. And that was the opportunity to just polish off your English. It turned out to be a popular option for a lot of Francophones. And I think this also speaks to how things have evolved and deteriorated since the time of the Parti Québécois. Now, Camille Laurent was extremely unpopular among the English-speaking community back in the 1980s, but you know, he was much more enlightened in his approach than the people that are running the show now.
Thanks, Chris. Just a sec. We're just going to come to a question from back here, and then this fellow, then you, okay? So John, read us a question from online.
Yes, we have two pretty similar questions about the Bill 96's effects on publishing and the arts more generally. So I'll just kind of lump them together. How will publishers, editors, writers, translators, and the publishing world in general be impacted by Bill 96?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned that earlier. We don't know at present, and this I checked with the SODEC and with the CALQ, which are the major funding organizations, and together account for $400 million a year in funding for the arts in Quebec. And they told me that it continues business as usual. They have received no directives, but I think we need to be vigilant and keep an eye on that space because it could change. I hope it doesn't. I don't want to give them any ideas. I'm hesitating a little bit because if you apply the logic of Bill 96, you would think, well, why would the government, if they want to erase English, which they seem to want to do, then why would they provide funding to English language arts organizations and publishing houses that are producing cultural products in English? But at the same time, we are part of the population, we pay taxes, we're entitled to that money. And I think that that's something that we need to keep underlining. It's an entitlement.
Yes, do, please.
I would just add to that for individual writers and well, I mean, that's who I represent with my organization, that those people are making a living as CEGEP teachers and in other places. And if they lose their jobs, they won't stay here because they won't find other ones.
No, that's great.
Thanks. So right here.
Can we rotate because they're also very, so we'll have one
Okay,
question
one
in
here,
person,
back
then
there, and
online,
then,
then in
okay,
person.
we could do that, sure.
Hey, first of all, thank you so much. This was great. We've seen in history that vote bank politics majorly works on the concept of divide and rule. Sometimes it takes 20 years, sometimes it takes 200 to get out of it. I think you mentioned that division always works. My question is towards you, Chris. Shelley is new and Vanessa has been here all her life, she said. You said you were away for 30 years. Before you went and after you came back, did you observe any socio-political changes or changes that you might have noticed in the society around you?
Yeah, thanks for the question. When I first came back, I'd been back about 6 months, and I wrote a piece for Le Devoir, the French language nationalist paper here, called Le Retour d'un Anglos après 30 ans. That's what it was called. And there were many things there were some things that had not changed. And when I left, René Lévesque was premier. It was separatist movement was at its apogee. Pierre Trudeau had just won a big majority in Quebec. He'd gotten all but one seat in Quebec, I think, was Liberal. And I thought, oh, this could change too. And it is and has. I also, the major social change that I noticed was that young people, young Quebecers, when they kind of assumed that they learned that I was English speaking, they would switch to English immediately, and they would say, oh, great opportunity to practice my English. This never happened 30 years ago. You know, it was, I found with Francophones generally, it was kind of a almost systematic, deliberate refusal to speak English with my generation, you know, with my cohort. And I was quite taken aback and pleasantly surprised. Okay, fine. Want to speak English? You can practice with me all you want. But that was a big change, and I guess it's from the, you know, the internationalization and English having become the international language, that there's a genuine willingness. I also felt there wasn't the same kind of chip on the shoulder feeling about Canada, and yeah, I mean, there's kind of an indifference to Canada, I would say, but it wasn't hostility with younger. I'm talking 35 and under. I have a lot of hope for your generation, you know, that they will make Quebec a more livable place. Legault is of my generation, and you know, they will pass from the scene fairly soon, you know, and I think that you know, I'm optimistic as far as that goes.
My students are amazing, and I'm optimistic on that front. They don't just speak French and English, and this wasn't true. When I was a kid, it wasn't true. And now it's true that all of my students speak 3-4 languages, always English and French is included in there. And then they speak Tamil, or they speak Hindi, they speak Mandarin. You come to our building and you hear every language under the sun in the hallways. These kids can do it. So I agree, like my generation, you're like, we're in a fight that has to end. We have to be inclusive because this place could be amazing, but we're making a mistake right now. But I do think the younger generation can speak multiple languages, and we can be inclusive, and we can celebrate French, and we can celebrate all the other cultures that are here, and we can make a thriving community. But everything that this government is doing is stopping us from achieving it. They don't please help. I mean, they don't. But that's right. But that's the thing, though. That's where I think what Guy said is really important. Is that's a fear tactic that is coming from higher up that we don't have to buy. We don't have to buy all of this. It doesn't have to be like that. So my husband, his family lives in Yamaska, which is near Sorel. I was like the first Anglo-Jewish Arab ever to show up there, let me tell you. And the entire village would come out when I came to visit. And they moved into the house, and they all would sit down, and they would just stare at me and go. And they would ask me question after question after question after question, right? Like this was like the show had come to town. And then I would go to mass on Christmas with the entire family, and everybody's like, oh, the Jewish Arab Buddhist scholar, English person came, right? Like it was a show, and everybody was so excited, and everybody was so warm. And then I went to Chanson Réponse, and I didn't understand a thing because they went so fast, but I tried to keep up with it. And I got an experience of Quebec that I also think is missing. And this is the thing, this is something that I also want to say, is that when I've talked about this in my classes, my English students don't always know about that.
No.
Sometimes my French students don't know about it. They don't have an experience of région. They don't have an experience of Quebec culture. We want to do things in this culture. We need to stop the fear tactics. We need to stop the exclusion. We need to make programs like Marianopolis and Brébeuf. We need to make programs like do a summer in région and learn, go to Abitibi, go to wherever and learn the culture of rural Quebec, because it's still alive and we don't need to be afraid of each other. And most people in région are just excited to meet you. Right, you're right. And there's a lot of fear in région too, like the crazy Montreal people who spread COVID everywhere. But it's true. But there's also, I've only received enthusiasm and excitement. And this is true not just in Quebec. This is true everywhere I've gone on Earth. Everywhere I go, when you go to meet cultures, communities, people are like, oh, who are you and what's going on and what is this about, right? And then I go into the kitchen, you start cooking, and that's the end of that, right? And everybody's just cooking together and eating together. We can do this. We're just not doing it right now. And we should not continue not doing it. Well, so then
here looks to the United States.
Well, but that's a mistake that we're making. So we need to go to Abitibi, and we need to go to Yamaska, and we need to go, and we need to bridge this, and not just, like, I was very angry at the beginning because you guys asked me the question that makes me angry, but, so it's all your fault, but I mean, I'm an international person. Everywhere I go in the world, I want to meet and learn and explore. It's true here too. So we have to make these bridges, and we have to not drink the Kool-Aid, and we have to not defend who speaks what language and what category I get into. Like, there's a lot of things we can fix here.
No, you're right. We have one back there and then one here, and then we'll come to you. So John, read us the question.
To what extent have Anglophones or opponents of Bill 96 tried to tell this story in French, in the French media, to try to gain allies?
He wants to come over here and grab the mic and answer that question. So Julie Barlow, former president of QWF.
Oh, no. Not president. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Who asked the question? I wasn't looking.
Well, it didn't-
Online. Okay, sorry. So that is a very good question, and it taps into a lot of things that I guess we're discussing tonight. I feel like the media are very much two distinct worlds. I work in both of them. It's interesting because I'm not at all considered anything particularly interesting or exotic as an Anglophone who works in French. I'm very much accepted as just who I am and what I represent. But I guess, I mean, they really are distinctive worlds, and the work that we did with the QWF in the last couple of years was to try and create more links with that, because we felt it was important to the survival of our organization to have as much. One of the problems, and Guy will know about this, is that when political decisions come down that affect writers, we are always out of the loop. We are never included in any kind of action at all. And so we made a really strong effort to become part of the conversation. And we are now. I think we can confidently say that with UNEC in particular, we count, we're there. We're on their plan, their strategic plan for the next 5 years, creating links with us. We've really made a lot of progress, but it's kind of fragile. Topics change, things move on. We haven't had news from UNEC for a while, you know. But I mean, I think that dialogue just has to happen, and someone has to make it happen. It doesn't happen naturally, I guess. I guess you can't ask the person online if that answers the question. But anyway.
Well, thank you. I would just add, though, that I know a number of people who've written to La Presse, Journal de Montréal, and Le Devoir, who've had a hard time getting their letters published. So, you know, not a lot of people make the effort, but not everybody who makes the effort succeeds either. So, you know, we need to do more, but there is a lack of receptivity on the Francophone side in the media. So you, sir, you've been patiently waiting. So, oh, you got a mic there? Okay.
This one. Hi, my name is Herbert, and I'm an allophone. It's has been very fascinating listening to the panel and also to the questions here. I came to Canada as a foreign correspondent covering Canada for the German radio and television network, like the equivalent of the CBC. And I have to say, Quebec has been very good to me, because there was always a good story out of Quebec. And one of the very first stories, I was invited to a comedy show on German television, and it was one of these correct or not correct things. And the question of the moderator was, there's a part in the world where it's forbidden to write stop on the stop signs. Is this a joke, or is this for real? And there were tons and tons of people calling in. It was a live show, a live television show. And they put me on the spot, and I had to say, unfortunately, it's real. And it's right here in Quebec. What I was going to say is, in a way, I was not really happy to come here tonight, because I hate to dislike Quebec. And after hearing what I've heard tonight, my wife was right. She stayed at home, because she said the same thing. She said, if I come here tonight, I know exactly what's going to happen. I go home, I feel isolated again we are already in a foreign country. We are foreigners already in a foreign country, Canada. And here we are in this micro country, Quebec again, and we are not welcome. I don't want to dwell into that, but my question would be, and it has been answered partly by the lady who spoke before. I was talking to a friend, a French-Canadian friend last night in Sherbrooke, and he's been living all his life in a very French-Canadian environment. And I told him where I was going tonight and what's going on, and with the tuition fees and with this and that. And he's a smart guy. He has a PhD. And at one point, he said, "That's not true what you're saying." I said, "Yes, it is true. Are you not reading your paper?" He said, "Yeah, I am." But my impression is that many French Canadians live in that bubble and they don't know what's going on. And when I say I hate to dislike Quebec, it's mostly I hate to dislike Quebecers, because most, as Chris, my friend Chris here knows, that most of my friends almost are French Canadian. And I like them. I love the language. I came here. It was my wish to come to Montreal. They wanted to put me to Ottawa. I was in Manitoba and in Calgary at first, and I said, no, I want to come here. I love the city. I love the vibe of the city. I love Quebec, and I still do. But it makes me sad. And just reading the paper, and it's not that we don't have any other problems right now in the world. You know, reading this morning that, yes, it was yesterday, that Monsieur Legault wants to rebuild the roof of the Olympic Stadium, which I don't care. I couldn't care less. No, but the phrase that stuck with me is that he says, because there are many people, many French-speaking people coming here, and they like to see the Olympic Stadium in a good shape. And I thought, this is not true. And I told my friend in Sherbrooke this, and he said, no, you're joking. I said, no, I made him a screenshot. I found the quote yesterday. He said, there are many French-speaking people, and they deserve to see the Olympic Stadium in good shape. So to make a long story short, it was fascinating to listen to all of you. And I mean, we come from the same, not from the same part of the world, but we are foreigners here, and I still feel like a foreigner as much I would like to feel as a born Quebecer. It will never happen, but it's not the end of the world. I just want to thank you to bring all this up, and I know it was probably a lot of work to prepare all this, and hearing your perspective. My son went to Marianopolis, and I will gladly tell him what you said. And he is one of those fluently trilingual. I mean, we speak German at home. He speaks English, French without a trace of an accent. And still sometimes he says, I don't really know, what am I? Am I German? Am I Quebecer? Am I English Canadian? I said, well, just be in Montreal. Just be one of them. Wherever you are, you're one of them. And it's not easy to bring someone up in a hostile environment like this, and to teach them the values we would like to have them live. But I think we did a pretty good job. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. John, do you have another question back there? And then we'll come to you, okay?
Testing. Okay, now it's working. To the many of us who do take this seriously and are being vigilant, what concrete steps can we take to stop the further erosion? The ballot box isn't delivering and doesn't look to anytime soon.
That's a good question. Anybody want to hazard an answer? It's a tough question. So how about you give us an easier question? You need the mic first so they can hear you. Snuck up behind you.
It snuck up on me. You want an easy? Well, I wasn't going to ask a question. I was making a comment. I am the enemy. I was a prof at Cégep de Montréal for 30 years. And it's interesting hearing you talk about Marianopolis. And I had a few thoughts about there really does seem to be an ingrained culture that the more I think about it now, and this conversation has made me realize it, that is dangerous. There seemed to be a differentiation between les Anglos, who, with or without an accent, who may speak French, but they don't know who Marie-May is. And that was considered, and we all heard that, and that is frightening. I also heard a comment, well, when the referendum ran, I was teaching technologie d'architecture, and I was scared to call my wife and speak to her in English. I was speaking French, she was speaking English back to me, because I knew there were people in my department who were crying, and I was scared they would get violent if they heard me speaking English. Other things that you may not realize is that when we do program planning, I was on the Comité d'Architecture for the architecture program. We compared our results to English CEGEPs in terms of grades, and the English CEGEPs were ahead of us. And I sort of got the feeling that if we could just lower the grades in the English CEGEPs, that would be okay, just so that they weren't ahead of us. And so that's the other thing. And if we're looking for things that we can do to support, unfortunately, our rampart used to be the federal government. And there were joint programs. I had a fabulous 8 years as the English representative of the Ministry of Education's website for information technology in English. I was the English editor, and it was partially funded by the federal government. It doesn't happen anymore. They closed it down. And I think there used to be more of an effort by the federal government to really promote bilingualism. And we need, I think, answer to question, to work with the federal government to say, no, you can't have asymmetrical bilingualism. And I think even though they're sort of saying, well, yes, you can, watch us. I think that's where our salvation lies. So, oh, one more thing. And I had a friend who was in the department, and I really did reach out. I had a lot of friends in the French department, and we were having lunch. And the guy sort of said to me, he said, I hate to confess this to you, but it still shocks me every time I walk by the English department and I hear no prof à Cégep de Vieux-Montréal en train de parler en anglais. And I said, well, get used to it. That's the way it goes. So, and on that cheery note, who's next?
Well, thank you for that insight. Anybody want to respond to that, Vanessa? Yeah.
Okay, I got very worked up, which I feel bad about. At my heart of hearts, I really believe people can just work stuff out. And I think most things are not as complicated as they seem. And so I do think there's things that we can do. This is a group of artists. We need to work as artists, right? We need to write, we need to explore, we need to imagine, we need to make friendships, we need to build bridges. Every time a bridge explodes, we have to go build another one. I think that's what we're supposed to do. I don't think we're supposed to, I think that is a tangible thing to do. I keep thinking about, this is gonna be off topic, but I can't get this out of my head. My family's Jewish Arab. So we speak Arabic, eat Arabic food. My whole family's been from the Middle East for like 1,000 years. I also have part of my family that now is Palestinian, and some of it that's Israeli. It's a really complicated time. I have a lot of emotions about everything that's going on in the Middle East right now. And my heart is broken in 50 different ways, which is part of why I got so worked up right now. Last night, I was on St. Catherine with my son. We were doing karate, and the pro-Palestinian protest happened right where I was. So I took my son, I said, let's go see. And so we went. It's a really complicated place for me to be. But my heart is broken for suffering. It's just suffering. I understand the history. I understand all the arguments, and I don't want to have them. And I have my views, and it's not the time or place. But I'm seeing suffering, and I'm seeing politics of exclusion, and I'm seeing identity games that are destroying people. So we walked with them, and then we went to the Israeli consulate. And I've never done that before, because I tend to stay away from protests because they're not friendly places. And people were chanting. So I don't speak Arabic. I just know how to swear at people if they get on my nerves. That's all my family was willing to teach me. So there was a woman behind me, and she was talking in Arabic. So I just kept asking her, what are they saying? And she kept translating it for me. And so I was talking about it with my son. He's 16, and we're going through and we're thinking it out and we're processing it together. And so it's free Palestine, and it's all right, and all things that I can resonate with and understand. And then at one point, they chanted something else, and I heard the word Israel, and I was like, uh-oh. And so I asked her, I said, what are they saying now? And she looked at me and she said, they're saying fall to Israel. And I'm like, well, fall to Israel, which I'm kind of like, well, right now, yeah. So I just kind of went, And then she looked at me and she went, are you okay? And I took a minute and I went, my family's Jewish. And she said, I had a feeling. And I was like, uh-huh. And then she took my hand and she said, God bless you for being here. And then I said, this is my son. And she said, God bless him too. And then we just held hands and we didn't talk. And they kept saying, fall to Israel. And the two of us just stood there like, this is uncomfortable, but I get it. And we're just not going to talk about it. This is just suffering right now. And we held I don't know this woman. And we just held hands. And then I said, okay, it's time to go now. And the SWAT team was getting a little excited. And so I said, okay, we'll go. And I didn't want to let go of her hand. And then before I left, I said, God bless you too. I don't know that I believe in God, but it wasn't the issue. Like none of all these terms and these definitions and these identities. And in that moment, we were just two human beings who just could see the humanity. And I just think this is to me the goal. And this we can do. So I think something really wrong is happening in the current political narrative. And I think it's important to call it out and identify it. But I think friendship is the answer. And I think building bridges and building communities and going back, and for Anglophones to go to Région and for us to make friendships and to build a QWF that goes with the whatever French version of it. Great. Like just, I think there are things we can do. It doesn't have to just be write a letter to the, right? Just build the friendships, build the community, and slowly, it's not going to happen tomorrow. We're going to have to be real patient with this. There's a wave of populism and it's all over the world. It's not going away. But if we can build some friendships, those tend to last better than almost anything else, right? Like what you were saying, that everybody around you just knows you as you, that's where we have to go.
Well, thank you, Vanessa. And I'm glad you came back to that point, because if we remember the second referendum in '95, it was a devastating emotional loss for the people who wanted Quebec to be separate. And yet there was not a backlash. There was not violence. It was accepted in good faith. There it was a shining moment of humanity in Quebec. And I think that we need to remember that there are people who want to harm us, and there are people who would like to see us leave, and there are people who would like to destroy our institutions. But I think we have reason to believe that a lot of people remain good people, human people, friends. And if we can work through this, we can get back to having those kind of friendships in society that we had, and that we can have it again. Rory, it is half an hour past. Now, I know you said we couldn't stay until midnight. I just want to get a sense of the room. I know there's one more hand there. I suspect John has some more.
10:30 until 10 o'clock.
Okay, so you're okay until 10 o'clock. Julie? Okay, so now I need to check with the panel. So are we good for another question or two? All right. So Ed had a question there.
I was wondering if there's anything we could learn from our neighbors to the east in New Brunswick, which is, as far as I know, the only bilingual province in Canada. Is there anything we can derive from how they manage their linguistic policies? And associated with that, how language minorities across the country are supported? I know there are francophones in every province and territory, and I know there are francophone associations. I was just wondering if we can learn anything from that and use that, build bridges with them. I don't know.
It's a very complex question. I mean, do you guys want to take a stab at it?
I could take a stab at it. I know that when as I mentioned, I was on the board of the Quebec Community Groups Network, which gets a lot of its money from the federal government, most of its money from the federal government. And it's under a program that's to support minority language communities across Canada. And in the course of doing that, we often met with francophone organizations outside Quebec, because they had the same Association des francophones, the Acadiens du Canada. I may not have it exactly right, but one of them, the president of that organization, told us, "You're just getting used to being a minority. You know, it's you're new at this. We've been at it for a long time." And they for them it's a struggle. I mean, Ontario, 600,000 or more francophones in Ontario. It's a significant size population, not as much, not as big as we are, and but they're not accommodated that much in Ontario. Francophone minorities, I don't think, I think it's a struggle. I mean, it is a struggle. They've had their struggles, for example, protecting the Francophone hospital in Ottawa, the Montfort, and they've had the other struggles, but they haven't been actually hunted in the same way. I mean, they don't have the institutions we have in Quebec, and you know, we often hear the comment made by Quebec nationalists that we're the best treated minority in the world, and so on and so forth. But you know, McGill University, that's something that was built with wealthy English Canadians who, okay, admittedly dominated the economy of Quebec at the time. Scottish James McGill and the fur trade money, that's where it came from. And then Macdonald College and so on that I mentioned earlier, that was tobacco money. But we built these institutions, and we through our history, that's because we were wealthy and dominated the economy. So we had philanthropists and so on that were able to do that. I think our case is a little bit unique. The New Brunswick is a little Acadian community, well-rooted. It's what, about 25-30% of New Brunswick. They're well-established. I think that's kind of part of why New Brunswick is also, it's got its unique kind of situation. And but I think really what you were saying, Vanessa, is that we have to come together. You know, this is one challenge also, I would say, is that because Legault and the CALQ includes a lot of former indépendantistes, they're not really interested in taking lessons from other provinces in Canada. They're not interested in doing things that are in a partnership with Canada. And so they don't see a need for reciprocity. They just sort of give us the money, go away, don't tell us what to do. We'll, you know, that's it. I think this case where you have the tuition issue that's just arisen now, where, you could say, well, eventually there's going to be a backlash. Other provinces might do the same thing and say, well, Quebec students are going to have to pay more. They're making us pay more, so they should pay more. And then you have a breakdown in the social solidarity that creates, that maintains a country. And that's a fundamental problem. And that's something I had meant to say earlier, but one thing is that with Anglophones in Quebec learning French, there's a social solidarity there. And in fact, the French immersion program that we have across Canada was invented by English Quebecers. 3 women in St. Lambert started this thing in 1965 with some support from Wilder Penfield, the neurologist, Dr. Penfield Avenue. And there's like 500,000, 500,000 kids are learning French and French immersion across Canada and BC and Alberta, and they're begging for teachers. They can't find enough teachers to fill, to meet their needs. And you never hear that story. And even if you did hear the story in the Francophone media, I think people wouldn't care. So what? I mean, how does that affect me? Well, it does affect you because it means that whole, the status of French in the world is lifted by this social solidarity that your fellow Canadians are expressing. It's a pretty major commitment to send your kids an act of faith when you're in a community where nobody's speaking that language, a little bit like what you were saying, Shaylee, at the beginning about learning French in Pondicherry. So I hope we can recapture that kind of social solidarity.
At the risk of sort of opening up a very large parenthesis, the situations are not particularly comparable because English was dominant in Quebec in a way that French never was in any other province. More than half of Montreal was English, more than 40% of Quebec City was English, and there's a global context as well. I mean, Anglophones are not afraid that if they leave their children alone with a radio or a television, they're going to learn French and become Francophones. It doesn't happen, but it does happen to Francophone children who become totally immersed in English by the media, and their parents feel that they're losing their language. So there are legitimate reasons for Francophones to feel that the way they're choosing to protect their language by victimizing and scapegoating us is not the best solution. I mean, we happen to have here the David Johnson, who was the Quebec representative of the Commission of Official Languages for a number of years. Do you have any thoughts you would like to add on that question, David?
I was wondering when you were,
Hi, my name's David Johnston. Same name as the former Governor General, but no relation. I worked with Chris early years at the Gazette and worked there for 33 years before going to the federal government and working with the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages. Before I left the Gazette for the federal government, Heather Monroe Bloom was principal in McGill, and she came to see us at the editorial board. And she told me that McGill had a unofficial quota system for admissions at the undergraduate level, which was very different from her experience as vice principal of the University of Toronto. She said, at McGill, we like to have 25% Montreal enrollment, 25% rest of Quebec, 25% rest of Canada, 25% rest of the world. When I was at University of Toronto, she said, we were 90% Ontario, 10% les autres. She said because University of Toronto had a different charter. The charter was not the same as McGill, one that was open to the world, had a different vision and mission, And I looked this morning to see if that's changed in the past 10 years. And I see that 23%, 27% of students now at the University of Toronto are foreign students. Something has changed dramatically in 12, 13 years in Toronto in terms of their admissions. And I look to see how many are students from other provinces, from Quebec, and so on and so forth. It's 1% from Quebec. And if you look at the provenance of anybody who has ever graduated from the University of Toronto, it's 88% from Ontario, 2% the rest of Canada, and the rest is foreign students. So there is such an asymmetry in the very nature of the two universities that it makes it difficult to compare and contrast. But I'll point out, there was a question here before about what's it like in other provinces for linguistic minorities? How does it compare? What are they doing in New Brunswick? And how's it working out in the rest of Canada? Well, New Brunswick has been an officially bilingual province only since 1982 as a result of the constitutional talks that was pushed by Richard Hatfield. They're questioning French immersion now in New Brunswick on the surface because they don't find the outcomes are very good for French language proficiency. But the deeper problem politically in some parts of the Anglophone community is they feel that they're being shut out from too many government jobs as Anglophones in New Brunswick because they don't speak French. And most Acadians speak English. Nationally, every province and territory, except British Columbia, has a ministry or a secretariat or an office in charge of Francophone affairs. That has grown since 1982 with the repatriation of the charter. The last thing I'll say is that in this democracy, voting power counts. And we have in Canada a situation where all four major political parties in Ottawa have memories of halcyon days when it won all the marbles in Quebec. Pierre Trudeau in the 70s, 74 or 75 seats. Patriations passed without Quebec's consent. Brian Mulroney comes in and sweeps Quebec, takes all the marbles in Quebec with a promise to bring Quebec back into the Constitution with honor and enthusiasm. 2 mandates later, he's pushed out, one of the most unpopular prime ministers in Canadian history. The Bloc Québécois wins all the marbles in Quebec. The leader of the opposition is Lucien Bouchard. That fades over time. Then the NDP under another Anglo-Quebecer, Jack Layton from Hudson, a decade or two after Brian Mulroney from Baie-Comeau, says, He gets the party to pass something called the Sherbrooke Declaration, which is a series of commitments designed to satisfy nationalism in Quebec. The orange wave sweeps Quebec. So in the lifetime of the baby boomer, we have seen all four parties win the lotto big time in Quebec. So what does that mean now for what's going on in Ottawa? It means that Quebec has a lot of political power right now. And it means that the English minority has never been as weak politically as it is now. Chris mentioned, well, how can you get out their message? How can we succeed? Before Bill 101 was passed, it was recognized that the leaders of the English-speaking community were corporate leaders. That all disappeared, and then some research by Jack Jetwab found that the new leaders of the English-speaking community happened to be media, happened to be CJAD and the Gazette. Look at what's happened to CJAD and the Gazette. Look at the weakness of the commentary compared to when Chris and I first started out at the Gazette. We had 3 people in the Quebec Bureau. We had Anthony Wilson-Smith, who went on to be editor of Maclean's. We had Jonathan Mann, who went on to be an anchor at CNN. We had Graham Fraser, who went on to be Commissioner of Official Languages of the Government of Canada, replaced by Don McPherson, who served 35 years in the job, and in one of his concluding columns said, "I've concluded after 35 years that they just hate us." They just hate us. Francophones hate us. But the research does show that Anglophones that have contacts with individual Francophones tend to find that's not true. The contacts are invariably, on the whole, agreeable. But what that means is that there's a hesitation for an Anglophone to step into the French-speaking group that you don't see with young Francophones who don't learn French. They're English in school, but when they come out, there they are in the Banff Springs Hotel. There they are in the Jasper Lodge. There they are in the fruit picking industry in the Okanagan, picking up their English. English opens the door to a colorful world where you're welcome. Whereas for too many Anglophones, French opens the door into a black and white world where they feel they're hated. And we've got to get over that somehow. And the answer would be through, as Vanessa was saying, you know, more of these structured partnerships or interactions. And that is starting to happen in the education system, but it's really at a very embryonic stage. As they say, it's complicated.
Thank you, David. That was very enlightening. John, do you have any more questions back there?
Yeah, we have two questions that they're kind of the same questions, so I'll just lump them together. Can we expect another exodus down the 401, etc., i.e. Anglophone Quebecers going to Ontario because of the CAC attitudes and bills? And is this the goal?
Two good questions, and they're different questions. So why don't we ask you first about, is that the goal? Is that what the CAC is trying to do? And then are we going to go for it? And how many of us are going to leave? Who would like to answer that?
Yeah, I think there's an element of, you know, it's been mentioned a few times for those of us longer members, 1995, the referendum, that was a huge disappointment for a lot of Francophone Quebecers. It was so close. It was a nail biter. It was a really upsetting evening, I think, for everybody. That whole seesaw, watching the numbers in the bottom of the television going 49, 51, 51, 49. It was as the votes were being counted, but a huge disappointment. And when Jacques Parizeau, remembering history here, Jacques Parizeau came out and said, "On a été battu, mais on a été battu par quoi? L'argent et les votes ethniques." You know, and it kind of started at that point that, you know, this is the way it was going to be. And a lot of, I mean, François Legault was part of the Parti Québécois at that time, and many others that are around him are from that background. And I think that ultimately they're trying to do a bit by bit, death by a million cuts to kind of reduce and limit, containment of Anglophone institutions so that they become smaller and are limited to these historic Anglos, and that you know, we don't want people from other provinces. We don't want to do anything that will allow the English community to replenish itself. And so that they will leave, or they will encourage their children to leave. I mean, I know my contemporaries, many of them encourage their children to leave. You know, our children are all in other provinces in the United States for the most part. The people that I grew up with. And I think that then this will produce a situation where you will win the next referendum, or you may not even need to have a referendum, or you create a situation where there will be some kind of backlash or intervention by the federal government, which can then be transformed into some kind of new type of referendum question. Well, we've had it, now that's it, and go to a vote and win this time. I think that that's part of a long-term strategy that's being worked on.
Any other thought? I mean, Shelley, what about you and your gang? How are you feeling about this? Are you considering leaving?
I mean, I'm no political pundit, so I really do not know if I have the knowledge to comment on the politics of all of this. But I wanted to add something when the question of friendship, when Vanessa said about building friendships, and then the question about looking to our neighbors to learn about how to support this kind of bilingualism. And as an artist, with what knowledge I have gained in the past 2 years of how the literary and the theater world of Montreal looks like right now, I feel we don't really have to look very far away, because we have concrete examples right here of how this kind of harmony and diversity can actually function in such institutions. And here I am referring to Teesre Dunya Theatre, headed by Rahul Verma, a theater company whose mandate is to give stage and voice to marginalized communities such as LGBTQ communities, immigrant communities, diasporic communities, First Nations. In fact, my most recent publication talks about one of his plays called Counter Offense, and how it creates this entire counter narrative to the discourse, to the nationalist discourse, which is being furthered by the government in the province right now, by creating characters from diverse backgrounds who clash with each other due to their ideological differences, and how this conflict is not black and white. It is very difficult to choose what is right and what is wrong. And then this is the beauty of multilingual interactions in this province. This is the beauty of everything that makes Montreal what it is. From where I stand, in what I have observed in these 2 years, it is this diversity which makes art flourish to such an extent in this community. And for me, art is always political. It always flourishes the best when it plays at an intersection. In fact, my own book right now, the one that just got published, is based on such an interaction where it borrows from myths of Sanskrit epic Ramayana, the myth of the Greek epic Iliad, and it tries to foreground a feminist perspective by drawing parallels between the lives of Sita and Helen. So I truly believe that art is most reflective. It is the richest when it exists at such intersections. And we have an example right here in Montreal of theater companies which are working at such intersections. Another company that I work with, Kabir Cultural Center, another organization which seeks to promote South Asian performance in arts. I work with the South Asian Film Festival of Montreal. The yearly festival was held at Bibliothèque Québec, right in front of Barrie UQAM. One of the beauties of their screenings were that each of these screenings had a movie by a South Asian artist or based on a South Asian theme in the local language, but always accompanied by English and French subtitles. And for me, this performance of cinema is a very wholesome picture of how such harmony can exist in diversity. Because what are these screenings doing? First, they are giving a platform to South Asian immigrants to come together to participate in this cultural event while getting access to art in the 2 dominant languages of the province. And from what I have been told is that the easiest way to learn a language is by consuming cinema in that particular language. Here we are consuming cinema with French subtitles. The second thing that this kind of screening is doing, giving access to non-South Asians to South Asian culture and creating awareness and giving them access in the 2 dominant languages of the province. So, this very wholesome picture which then emerges of how we can build these bridges, how institutions, artistic institutions, theaters, and literature can work as this bridge between 2 different cultures. Because in reality, they are not really very different. These cultures are made up of people like you and me, people who want to go about their everyday life and earn a living and be happy with their family. And it's not really that difficult or an impossible task to understand each other, no matter what the language is. So, we really do not have to look very far away to get concrete examples of how we can sort of create a narrative which does not give into this very divisive politics that the government wants to propagate right now.
Well, thanks.
That's very smart. But we're actually not just two cultures here. And I think we're having this conversation of the English and the French and the English and the French and how hurt we are right now by the dominant politics. But we also have Indigenous cultures here in Quebec and in Canada. And like the Kabir Project is a beautiful example, but we need to be inclusive, which means I have this fantasy in my head that we should have every school should be bilingual and trilingual, but that would never fly in anybody's world. But we need to actually be inclusive. We need to recognize the Indigenous history. There are all kinds of cultures in Quebec and that are here longer than the English and the French that are fighting. I think there's a lot we can do. We can be like, it's logistically possible, right? India is the perfect example. 26 official languages, 1,000 dialects. Like, it's unreal what goes on in India. It's obviously logistically possible. We have to have the will to recognize each other and live together. So we have to get that. We have to make the will, I think. The logistics.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think that's a good place to leave it, unless somebody has a really burning question they would like to ask. Final question. Julie? Take the microphone.
I just wanted to bring up something that no one has brought up tonight that I think taps into a little bit of what everyone is saying, and which is kind of depressing in the short term, but perhaps not so depressing in the long term, which is right now the political situation we're in is kind of like double screwing us. We're Montreal. The CAQ doesn't give a crap about what happens in Montreal. Do they have a single riding in Montreal? Like we're like disposable right now. So why not beat on the English community? A little satisfaction from, the people who vote for the CAQ, and it's no cost to them whatsoever. So when you evoked the PQ possibly coming back into power and that being worse, I personally don't think it's going to be worse. The PQ will need Montreal.
Yeah, good point.
And there we are. And then all the values that we represent, I mean, those don't exist for the CAQ right now. So yeah, so there's hope.
Well, that's a fairly hopeful
I
interpretation.
think there's hope.
I think we could debate it, but
and one other thing I just wanted to mention, which earlier regarding my comments about building bridges with UNEC, Union Nationale des Écrivains du Québec, which is that, and this again is a good lesson, I think. We see eye to eye, they wake up and realize who we are when we realize that we're fighting for common things, So maybe Montrealers have to get together and start forgetting about the language division and fight for our city a little bit more. Just an idea.
good idea. Any last comments from the panelists? Vanessa's looking exhausted. Yeah, it's been a hard week. So I would like to thank our three panelists. I'd also like to thank Lori, Riley, and John and the Quebec Writers Federation for hosting this evening. And I'd like to thank all you folks for coming out and you folks for being online and for your questions and for your attention. So thank you. Give yourself a round of applause.
Oh. That was great.
Yeah. Great panel.
Really? Really gave me a lot of stuff to digest, which is always what I'm looking for.
A number of new ideas that came out there, yeah.
Yeah, and so many times I wanted to jump in and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna shut up and just listen. And I'm glad I did, because I learned a lot from points of view that I hadn't even considered.
Yeah, well, they have such different perspectives. Yeah, yeah.
It was excellent.
Yeah.
Really food for thought,
And you're looking much better. At least compared to what.
Thank God. About Saturday night, it turned around. And I've been feeling much better.